The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
So your response to this series has been amazing. I honestly did not know how you all would take such a intense dive into the problems of progressive media spaces and progressive political spaces and how they actually reflect and operate similarly to establishment spaces and in some cases white supremacist spaces. I honestly did not expect all of the positive feedback and so many new followers from this podcast series. That lets me know that this is a very important conversation. I owed you today's episode like yesterday. But as I started to edit on Sunday evening, I realized I honestly got everything I needed out of the conversations that I had with Professor Sinkowitz and with Q and Aaron, parts 1, 2, and 3. And I decided, or realized rather, with the help of a good friend, that while I address some of the issues of these spaces being just as male dominated, I didn't address it with the voice of women. So in my own way of pointing out the problem, I was exacerbating the problem. And so Wendi Muse, well, let me start by saying this. There's rarely been something that I have said that I don't go back later and see that the women I generally hang with have said already. And when I say hang, I mean online, digitally. I don't get a chance to listen to. I honestly don't listen to podcasts. I don't listen to much of anything. When I unplug from this, I'm going to now listen to gospel music, which is totally weird considering like I had an entire spell of my life where I didn't even look at church. But I digress. That's not the point. The point is I don't get a chance to listen to podcasts, and I don't read a lot of articles online. I read a lot of books offline. That being the case, what I have come to discover is that most of the fights that I get into, they were already fought by two people in particular, Wendi Muse and Noah Changa. And it is rewarding in the sense that I've carved out a space that and a circle, rather, not a space, but I've carved out a circle of peers who, even if we aren't communicating with each other, we are on the same wavelength. And that has been the case over and over and over again. I can give you very specific examples. The entire fight that people thought I fought with Caitlin Johnstone over aligning with Nazis, that space had already been, that fight had already been fought by Wendi Muse and Noah Changa. And I basically just came in like the cavalry. That's it. So that's just one example. There's some other recent ones, but it escapes me. But I bring that up because of two things. Well, probably three things. We'll see when I start to list them. Women lead. And I mean that very specifically, very literally. I find, and I have found, outside of political spaces as well as in political spaces, I have found that women are willing to take on fights long before men are. And even in context of me personally, this doesn't reflect any type of cowardice on the part of men. Sometimes it does. Speaking for me, mine has, as I've established in this podcast for a very long time, mine has always been about a reluctance to use my platform as a bludgeoning tool, or to use my platform to constantly be in fights. Because I felt, this is what I thought. I've thought about it and I've changed my mind since. But at the time, for the last 2-3 years on Twitter, I felt that I should, as a person with a platform, not engage in crushing other people or bringing some dogpiling. And so I always saw when someone was saying something ignorant or someone was saying something problematic, I either just ignored it and went past it. And because I didn't want to be seen as that guy with a large following who is stomping on these, poor, weak progressives. Well, women generally know better. And they understood the problem of letting these things metastasize and grow and fester, particularly Wendi Muse and Anoa Changa. So because they lead, it just makes sense, absolutely, that they should have more representation in this space. The problem that we have in terms of this space being so white is magnified when you talk about gender. I cannot think of a single podcaster outside of the folks that I hang with who have a podcast that is, well, I have to actually start that sentence again, because even the people that I roll with, Noah's podcast, Wendy's podcast, a couple of other podcasts of people who are writers who write for the Progressive Army, they have great content, but they don't have great reach. So they run into the same problems. And the way that you get reach is if you simply say what is comfortable to that same white male space. It's just a matter of fact. I mean, it's a game of demographics. It's a game of numbers. And this is the reality that they have faced. So I've said enough already. I know I said there was going to be 3 points, but, who's counting, right? But the point is this: in this conversation, I have pointed to the problem by actually perpetuating the problem. And so I'm going to fix that today. I want to bring in on today's podcast, I'm going to play a segment of the Leftist Pocket, the Left Pocket podcast, which is the podcast hosted by Wendi Muse. And she is in a conversation with Sangeetha Sudarsan at San, I believe, DN on Twitter. And this conversation really illuminates that problem specifically, how these spaces are male dominated more than anything else. And, it just makes sense to me that if women are on the front line and women are taking the lead and women have absolutely no problem fighting fights when the rest of us are going past the fight for whatever reason, be it cowardice or a reluctance to, go nuclear on every single fight, whatever our excuses are as men, if women are leading the way, then, clearly they should have equal representation in our media. But that's a problem when they have to address issues that are critical to their experiences as women, because men don't want to hear how they're problematic. Or if you want to get very shorthand with it, they don't want to hear how men are trash. Hell, I know I didn't want to hear that for years. Oh my goodness. You want to talk about growth. Not only did I have to grow out of my homophobia that was rooted in my black church experience, I also had to grow out of the patriarchy that I was groomed into. And my disdain for hearing constantly how men are problematic. And then you turn around and finally realize one day, well, hell, we really are problematic. So when you talk about those issues, imagine how many people turn off the podcast and never go back to it. And that is the perfect example of how exactly it is that these independent media spaces and progressive political spaces look and operate exactly like establishment spaces, be it conservative establishment or be it the neoliberal, democratic establishment. All right, I've said enough. Let's listen in to Wendi. Wait. One last thing. A perfect example of how far ahead of the curve that women are taking the lead. This podcast if I could date it, it was during the Joy-Ann Reid boycott that happened, in March? So March, April, May, June, July, August, about six. Yes, I literally just counted. About 6 months ahead of this entire series. So thank you, Wendi, for sharing this with me. I hadn't had a chance to listen to it, but now all of us are going to listen to portions of it.
We actually started talking quite a bit about pop culture and some of the things that we felt like when we were looking online and seeing with regard to certain women that we just weren't fully being represented by them. But at the same time, another thing that sort of brought us together was the simple fact that we looked around and we saw, okay, this Bernie bro myth is really frustrating because we said we're both women of color. We both have left-leaning ideas. You're not even in the United States, but I was at the time during a big chunk of the election outside of the United States. So we're kind of talking about things that don't necessarily fit the mold of what a Bernie bro is or Bernie bro, quote unquote, specific ideas and interests. And at the same time, as we're actively trying to refute this both during and after the election by saying, no, there are many women who are left-leaning, who may have voted for Bernie, who support Bernie, or even criticize Bernie from the left. There are many women, there are many people of color. Don't erase us. At the same time, we looked at new left media. So all of these new blogs and podcasts and, websites and video streams, YouTube channels, they kept popping up and they were almost entirely comprised of white men. So what do you think about that? Because it's kind of difficult to battle against the stereotype while at the same time the media that's supposed to be representing you is almost entirely that stereotype.
Well, for starters, we want to address the idea that, we are women of color and we have very specific ideas. But, we also want to work and talk about politics in a way that does not specifically relate to our identities, like, solely as black and brown women, or if we're queer. We want to simply talk about politics in a way that, has legitimate value. We want to say, okay, we are left-leaning women, but we're also not, especially when it comes to specific, there were quite a few racist ideas against, black women criticizing Bernie Sanders. There was this idea that, you were just angry black women. That was rather offensive and obviously racist. And so we want to,
just a tad.
We want to evolve past that. We want to have our ideas legitimized whilst not having our identities brought up all the time. And this was specifically seen with the whole Bernie bro thing that was happening. We saw a lot of, left-leaning white folks, use our identities and quote us and use us all the time. Like, this person is a woman of color. She's queer. How dare you, disregard her ideas. And we really don't want that, because while we want our identities to be, recognized, we're not solely our identities. And that is a very specific problem in a very small leftist space, even though it gives us a lot of, it gives us at least a platform, to voice our opinions freely, right? At least as freely as we can.
I mean, that's still something that I see happening too, which is the crazy part. So even now, long after the election has come and gone, sort of. I mean, I feel like 2016 never quite ends, but it's the endless year.
I think we've rehashed 2016 about 20 times in 2017, and I think 2017 was just lost.
Right? Yes, it was. It was like the epilogue. It was the epilogue to the long durée of 2016. But what's funny is that I still see this happening, and even by people that I would normally consider allies, and I think have generally good politics. As much as I think they do sincerely appreciate the voices and contributions by people of color, by women of color, to be even more specific, they at the same time often do exactly what you just mentioned. So they'll kind of pull out the token, black leftist or the token Asian leftist or whatever, and they'll say, okay, this person exists. So every time you talk about Democratic voters only being people of color and establishment Democratic voters, you're erasing this group or you're erasing that group. And I don't want to be pulled up only when you have a chip, when you need a chip, you need something to lay on the table and say, here, this person exists. I do actually want to be pulled up, however, if you're talking about ideas and things that we consider politically, right? I mean, it's a completely different type of relationship to have with someone.
I think we can also talk about it in terms of the Joy-Ann Reid boycott, for example. So, yeah, I mean, let's really think about it this way. So she's a Black woman, and, she's an elite Democrat, well, at least an elite media, critic, well, not media, political commentator, whatever you want to call her. And, well, we see this kind of boycott of her, which is fine. But at the same time, we want to also address the kind of disproportionate sense of how we react to, neoliberal women, right? So we don't see this kind of incredible attack on white men, white women. And it's not that we want to be on constant attack mode. It's just that it seems to be this really disproportionate sense of how we view particular demographics. So we don't want to boycott Joy-Ann Reid just because, she is a
like a neoliberal, right? It's just
just because not just because she's a neoliberal as well, but we have certain ideas that need to be opposed. There's this that we have conservatives like Ana Navarro, who isn't boycotted in that similar sense, even though she is pretty much a right-winger who hates Trump, right? You don't see that kind of attacks. Or even with Megyn Kelly, whatever her name is, that's her name, right? Megyn Kelly. Yes. Yeah. That's the kind of thing we see. We see this kind of these specific ways in which women are attacked, especially women on the liberal left. Right now, sure, liberals or, centrists have, questionable politics, but we also want to see what it means to be a person of color, a woman of color in these spaces, online, occupying these spaces, and being able to oppose the ideas on their ideas alone instead of, boycotting them just because they hold a specific identity.
Right. I mean, the joycott, as it's called, which I think is it's interesting, really, really well done portmanteau of sorts. But I think it's interesting that there are a lot of people, even on the nominal left, right, who maybe are white men who've had on guests, for example, for their podcasts or written about, or even are in cahoots with, they're friends with a lot of people who are well-known liberal pundits and the like, and they definitely don't receive the same degree of vitriol from a lot of the left-leaning Twitter followers or Twitter participants, people on Twitter in general, right? It's kind of fascinating that a lot of the barbs and arrows are thrown her way. And while I think they're often justified, because I also have issues with a lot of the behavior that Joy-Ann Reid exhibits on TV, online, etc. She's a very problematic figure, to say the least, and to put it nicely, on the left, or at least on the liberal left. But I think it's important for us to think about ways that these types of actions we remember them, right? So as a person of color, as a woman who's Black, I'm looking at this situation and I'm saying, yes, I disagree with Joy-Ann Reid. I often also mention, that I have problems with some of the things that she said, but I also have issues with the things that Joe Biden says. And I also have issues with the things that even men on the left say, women on the left say, right? The far left. So I think it's important that we're not getting hyper-focused on certain people because, or at least people just, I don't know how to put it. I feel like some of the attention, on the one hand, she becomes hyper visible precisely because she's a Black woman, right? And in that process, as a Black woman who's on the left, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, her and then other women I've seen, who are women of color, who are journalists, who are dogpiled for a small criticism here or there, even if they too identify as leftists, it makes you look at the situation and say, okay, so I am not allowed to dissent. I am a Black woman, am not allowed to have a different opinion on anything. I can't, point out some small flaw, even in these everyday discourses that we have.
Now, I don't intend on interrupting much more, but I have to pause here because, how they just explained their problem and why it troubled them to see the type of dogpile that took place over the Joy-Ann Reid boycott, was exactly how I was feeling. And they just put it into great terms, particularly from being women. So these perspectives are so critical. But anyway, let's get back to listening. I'm enjoying it as much as you are.
Any kind of actual punishment for it. But that is still, a background that still radiates in your background. When you look at Kianga Yamata Taylor and the way she received death threats over criticisms of Trump. Right. Just Trump, right? And that's a kind of, it doesn't matter even if you're online or in the academy or it seems to follow you everywhere. And that is such a disproportionate, again, that word it's so important. It's that is so disproportionate compared to, white people or white men. And that's what we find so, frustrating, because we want to say or feel without feeling like we represent an entire community where, because, women are not monoliths, and surely even Black women are not monoliths as well. We have differing opinions, so we're not all the same. And yet we're tokenized at the same time. So what do you reckon? What do you think needs to change in what kind of model, what kind of behavior do we need to model to make sure that these spaces are far more accessible and and so that everyone can get in on with the fact that we still need our own voices without feeling like we're being pulled back, so that we don't alienate some people, especially our wonderful white ally.
Yeah, I mean,
I say wonderful with quotations.
Right. It's really hard because on the one hand, you definitely you're trying to think about other people's opinions, right? Which is a horrible way to be a political writer or to talk about politics. But the reality is this is human nature, right? When you're having a conversation with someone, you should be listening to them, and you should be trying to incorporate some of their ideas into what you think and trying to find ways where you meet in the middle, right? And I think a lot of us make those negotiations in our everyday behaviors online and off. This is just sort of normal. Unless you're a totally terrible person, you don't care what anyone thinks ever, and you just do whatever you want all the time. You're I don't know, but usually this is how it works, right? And I think in political conversations, job or no job, PhD candidate, not PhD candidate, whatever my condition is, I tend to just be that way. And when I'm on Twitter, I'm also that way. So I try, for the most part, I've tried to use Twitter as a space to have conversations, not just to put out my idea and not listen to other people's ideas. At the same time, when people come at me and they're being condescending, they're being offensive, when they clearly don't know me, they don't know my history online and my thoughts, it's frustrating. So, for example, sometimes people just see that, okay, I have a brown face and therefore I must support Hillary Clinton, or I must be a neo-lib. This is literally it happened to me so many times. And so I'll say something that perhaps is criticizing someone like Sanders from the left. And I'll get these responses that are why are you supporting the neoliberals? You must have voted for Hillary, blah, blah, blah. And I'm actually no, but thank you for making assumptions about my politics just because I'm being critical of your favorite person, right? And this is all wrapped into racial stuff and gender stuff, right? Yeah. And so I think one way to be better is to kind of give people the fucking benefit of the doubt.
Benefit of the doubt, yeah.
Yeah, and understand where people are coming from. Don't come out of the sky saying, lecturing me on my own political leanings. I mean, it's very weird. I think, and again, a lot of the people doing this happen to be, I'm saying that, men. Yeah, they happen to be men. They happen to be white men. And I think that it's also just a socialization thing. I mean, within our society, white men are given ultimate authority. They're taught that they are, socially at least, maybe not by their parents always, but they're taught by the society that whatever they do, they're always right. Whatever they do is fine. And so I think a lot of that...
there's no repercussions to... Yeah, they own the space around them. Oh, my goodness.
And so that becomes the problem. I mean, that's the problem. And I think one way to sort of fix that is try to have conversations with people. Try to, and especially and I've talked about this in an article that I wrote for Progressive Army, try to understand when people are being bad actors and good actors, when people give them the benefit of the doubt if they're coming from a good place. And if it's obvious that okay, it's it's someone who's a famous pundit, neoliberal, blah, 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 or conservative, then that's different, I guess. But even then, don't always assume that their politics are all just monolithic either, right? I mean, there are some people who I think are ending up going toward the Democratic Party as the answer because they don't feel like they have a space on the left, which is a bigger problem in my opinion, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people are worried about like losing young white men to the Nazis, and I'm sitting here going, wait a second, but what about like young black people who sat out this election and who are then watching you, like they took a big stand in this election against Hillary Clinton and against neoliberalism, and then there are still white leftists online who are like shitting on them. So shitting on black people in particular. So I'm like, wait. Y'all need to make sure that you're not also losing people to the Democrats or to the liberal left in large droves because you don't want to talk about identity at all, or you want to like dominate this space. So
wonderful class only politics. You know, I used to think that class only leftists were like, you know, rare. They were just the bizarrely anti-identity people. I thought they were just one of the very few people, and unfortunately they kind of tend to dominate the discussion now that I think about it.
The podcast is entitled No Girls Allowed, and I think it's an hour and a half long, and I'm only bringing you about 15 minutes of it. So I'm linking it in the description. We're not done. I'm not done playing clips, but I just wanted to stop and say that, as well as you know, maybe it's confirmation bias, but it is good to hear other people who, especially when you're in a marginalized space, and whether, you know, some people hate that phrase marginalization and marginalizing, but the fact is when you have a minority opinion, especially in a space that purports to want to represent your minority opinion, but yet and still what you believe is the minority opinion, it really is helpful to hear other people convey your thoughts, what you're thinking, and convey it in a very succinct fashion. Listen to this next clip, and this one is important because, well, you'll see why. Take a listen in.
I don't want to be silent either about people who I think are abusive. There were a couple of guys who were outed as, you know, predators, and one of them in particular had a lot of followers, and this one was a recent one, and I found that person to be particularly suspicious, but I never said anything. And that's also something that I think about as well. Why am I being silent as well? And I don't think that it's particularly my fault. It's simply almost a form of self-preservation, a form of like trying to protect yourself, because you know that if you were to say something, you're going to be interrogated to hell and back, and you really don't want it. You don't want it. And that's the kind of humiliating process that we try to protect ourselves from. And the fact that it's still existing in leftist spaces is absolutely unacceptable.
Right. And I think it goes back again to this idea of dogpiling, right? Because even in the case of political opinions or noticing something, I mean, I one of the good examples here that's parallel a bit is, you know, pointing out sometimes that, oh yeah, there's racism in this space, or you're being a little bit racist, you're being a little bit xenophobic or whatever. And I think sometimes because these people are on the left who are committing these things, they say to themselves, oh, you know, of course I'm above that. So anything that I do, I'm an ally. So you can't really deem what I'm, yeah, I know. You can't really, how dare you, right? Like, how dare you say, or, you know, interrogate or question my leftist bona fides, when in actuality you're saying, no, I want to make you a better leftist by pointing this out to you in a way that you can make our space better and more inclusive and like work for everyone. Because just a minute ago you were complaining about how there are no women and there are no people of color at your meetings or at your, you know, social forum or whatever, but then you're engaging in behavior that turns them away. So I'm trying to help you, like I'm trying to make things better for you, and you're not listening precisely because you have this belief that you are somehow shielded by virtue of being on the left. And I think with regard to a lot of what you were saying just now about sexual harassment and people being kind of creepy and whatever, we're often reluctant to say anything because we don't want to air dirty laundry necessarily and give more fodder for people who are attacking us from the right. But then at the same time, we also don't want to have to deal with people who don't believe us or who don't understand what we're really getting at, or who also see us technically as the bad actors when we're actually the ones who are operating in good faith and trying to make things better.
I know I said I wasn't going to interrupt, but there are just so many great points that Wendi and Sun are presenting here. And this is the one that I identify with the most, because I regularly say that, that I don't speak out about things because I don't want to be seen as the person who is attacking out of bad faith. And they literally just had an entire section of their segment there that outlines from a woman's perspective why they often don't say anything about stuff that is problematic because they don't want to come off as the person in bad faith. And what does that say about our circles, our spaces, that women have to be silent about issues about issues as critical as sexual abuse, because they feel as though if they say something, this person might be beloved by a whole bunch of people online. And if they say something, then all of a sudden they become the bad actors. I mean, this is indicative of why the progressive space looks and acts exactly like the mainstream space. It's almost, I mean, this is literally what they're doing with the Kavanaugh trial right now. I call it the Kavanaugh trial, but it's not a trial. And actually, let me take that back, because that is the premise that they're using to try to excuse away or to dismiss his accuser. They're trying to use the idea that he's on trial. He's not. He's applying for a job, but I digress. We'll get to Kavanaugh tomorrow, or actually one of these days this week, because there's a part 5. But the whole point of me going off on that tangent is the fact that that is the exact same technique that the establishment uses to insulate itself from criticism from women and criticism from black people. Now, I also want to make this point before I toss it back to Wendi and Son. Some people, very small, maybe about 5 people, and I probably shouldn't address something that has only been presented to me by 5 people, but I think that this presents an opportunity to make a very salient point. Some people question why I always defer or amplify women, and why I'm more than happy to admit when I've said something wrong, pretty much basically only to women. I don't really do that to anyone else. Women of color specifically, I will admit when I've done something wrong. I'll admit it publicly. People like, one person said I'm genuflecting before women. The reason that may be the case is because wrapped up in their struggle is the framework, it is the same model. What they are pressing to get through, what they're fighting to break free from, the oppression that they're trying to overcome, is almost item by item, line by line, issue by issue, a reflection of what I am trying to overcome as a black man. The only thing I have to do to be able to understand and to benefit from their experiences is to understand my role in their struggle, and how within the framework of their struggle, I have the ability to be the oppressor. If I can get beside myself, not beside myself, that has a different colloquial meaning. If I can get beyond myself and my ego, then I have true allies who have the model, who have thought these things through, and have the ammunition, the logical ammunition, the intellectual ammunition, and the philosophical and the political ammunition that we need to overcome. So it makes sense that we do what we have to do. And notwithstanding the fact that we're doing what we have to do to win, but it's also the simple fact that every single one of us have the ability to serve both as the oppressed and the oppressor. And if we are too egotistical to recognize how I, as a black man, have played a role in the oppression of some women, then how can I ask white progressives to understand how they similarly have played a role in the oppression of Black people in general and our voices specifically based on this conversation. I hope that made sense. But if I can't understand that for women, how can I understand that? How can I ask that progressives understand that for me? That's why it's important to hear these voices and to amplify them. All right. I'm sorry. I know you came to hear Wendi and San today. But they're blessing me. As we say in the church, they're blessing my spirit. Let's keep listening.
I mean, and we had this conversation so for those who maybe don't know this, I should disclose this. This conversation actually stemmed from a side conversation that we had for months. This is many, many months ago. We were thinking about writing an article to talk about sort of the ways that New Left media had replicated a lot of the same problems that the mainstream media had in terms of gender and representation, people of color, et cetera, and how the spaces remained predominantly white and male despite all the posturing and commenting about how we wanted to have a more egalitarian left. But I think it's interesting that even we talked about this. You and I were both saying, is there a right time to publish this? Is there a right place to publish this? And I think there was a lot of back and forth for both of us to kind of think about, well, what does this space in which we are criticizing the fact that so many left spaces are predominantly white and male, what does a space that would publish that look like, right? And would our conversation even be taken seriously, or would it just be sort of dogpiled once we put it out as more identity politics drivel? And I think that, it's sort of a macro question, but there is a lot going on in your commentary here. And I think something that applies to a lot of our experiences where we tend to obsess over something, we hold it in because we either don't think it's going to be good enough, or we have all these other side issues to worry about the space and the receptivity of that, the reception in that space,
Yeah, so we have to hold ourselves to the highest of standards, and it's so demoralizing because there's a very good chance that we might be able to, flourish in these spaces in a good way, in a way that can, inspire others and help others and make sure that their voices are risen as well, where we can champion those voices, where those voices can champion ours. And that seems to, I feel like, at least for me personally, I feel like I police myself a lot, despite how I sound on Twitter. I feel like I actually do police my thoughts a lot. And that is very reflective on the fact that, I struggle with writing. It's one of the main things that hurts me a lot, is because I want to write. I really want to write. I feel like I have thousands of ideas and I can't put them on paper because white supremacy exists and we feel like we can't, live up to that bloody standard. So yeah, that's pretty much what's happening. And especially not just in political ideas, even if my ideas are not that great, I still would like to have that kind of confidence to still put up my work and be like, okay, let's start here. I don't have to go fully left wing as well, but I also would like to write, and I would like to put something out there, and I would like to start a ball, get the ball rolling. Oh, that would be great, right?
Yeah, I think our discussion is one way, perhaps, to get the ball rolling for you.
I think maybe I'd like to see more podcasts with women of color, not just white men. And one podcast with a few women, just women, and I'm just sitting there going, you're all white. Right. I don't feel like I can be as unabashed with my thoughts because I have to worry about how you guys feel.
That's the last clip I'm going to play because I want you to go and listen to the entire podcast. It's, like I said, it's like an hour and a half. And I know between my commentary in between, I don't think I gave you even 20 minutes of it. So it is rich. It is, it's a rewarding conversation. I will put the link in the description. Go listen to it. But the last thing I want to say, particularly about what San said at the end, we have to get our own spaces, and we have to get our own spaces with the funding to amplify our voices to the level that they need to be amplified, because it's just not going to work. It's not going to work. The reason it's not going to work is because if for us to say what needs to be said, it either means we have a true ride or die ally who is going to who is going to be okay with the fact that we are going to have a conversation from time to time about how they individually as a person have been problematic, or we're going to have conversations about how their demographic has been problematic. And that usually doesn't end well. I can tell you from my personal experience, it just doesn't end well. I had an entire company shut down because of that. In a whole nother state. I'm in Georgia, freelancing, doing work because a company couldn't handle that, because, liberals can't really be racist. The real racist is Donald Trump. Similarly, progressive spaces, while they have the appearance and they may have some of the language right, when it comes time to actually discussing how this space itself is a problem, then they respond just like mainstream Democrats and mainstream Republicans. So, and last but not least, rather, it's not that we need you to give up your platforms to us and to release them to us, and we have be in charge over it, which I don't think, for anyone who claims to be a communist should be a problem. But I digress. We're not even asking for that. What we're asking for is for your space to be open to who we truly are. And if your space isn't open to who we truly are you really an ally? And because it has been the case, and I don't know, this is how sad of a situation it is. Benjamin Dixon, me personally, probably have been on the forefront of exploring these spaces for people of color who don't want to be the token anti-identity politics voice. I'm probably the number one person who's going to outlet, worked with this person, worked with these people, worked with that company, didn't get that got this gig temporarily, but they thought better of it and said, oh no, never mind, traveled here and done this. And I don't really even have a big name. I'm not even really that guy. I don't really have enough following. I'm literally out here hustling just like everyone else just to make ends meet. But yet and still, I have been on the forefront of trying to find that space, and not only find it for myself, but to find it for everyone else who needs that kind of space. Thus the Progressive Army. But I said all of that to say this. I've searched all over and it doesn't exist. I've talked and I've tried to build it with other companies, and it doesn't exist. And not only does it not exist, but it becomes problematic when you try to create it. And again, in case I lost anyone, is simply spaces where Black people and people of color and Black women, we could just, and Black men, obviously, we can say and be what we really are and who we really are. And until we find that space, we'll hang out with you progressives, as much as we can, but there's a limitation to it. And the real problem as to why we can't just go the distance together, particularly both in media and in politics, is because there's too many of you white progressives who are not genuinely comfortable with us saying what we really have to say. What you want instead are people, Black women, women of color, people of color, to say what you already believe and what you already think. I feel really comfortable about this conversation at this point. I'm not even stressed about it because, it's not going to, my support base has already demonstrated that they're here for me. So I'm blessed. I'm good. I'm okay. I can have this conversation because I've accepted levels of survival and success to afford me the autonomy to say this without fear of what my boss is going to say, without fear of what my audience has got to say, because I have been blessed again with supporters, mostly white supporters. I have to go through and look at my demographics, but it's a small group. We're talking about 230 some odd patrons, and that small group, they're here to hear what I have to say, even if that means that I'm saying things that speak broadly about their demographic. I have to remember I'm in the South, and I have to work really hard to not just speak in a Southern dialect all the time. But that's 243 patrons or I forgot the exact number, compared to millions of people, millions of white progressives who want us. But the question is, do they really want us, or do they just want us to speak on their behalf? Part 5 coming up this week. I don't know if it's going to be tomorrow for sure, but I'm speaking with Noah Changa, who actually was the motivation behind this entire conversation, with an interview that she did with Professor Sinkowitz, my friend from Boston, last week. So I'm going to conclude with Noah and just let her say it in her own voice in real time about all the stuff that we've been talking about. Thanks for hanging out with me. Special thanks to Wendi and San for a fabulous conversation. Go subscribe to the Left POC podcast. If you are a supporter of mine, you should be a supporter of theirs, because literally what you just heard me say all last week and this week, they said 6 months ago. And not only should you subscribe, but I'm going to do better, and I'm actually going to listen more. If I don't listen to any podcast, that would be the one that I'm going to require myself to listen to, because some of the stuff that I take months to figure out, they already had figured out. So anyway, I think I'm going to continue my personal therapy. I'm doing this new thing, like I'm writing songs, like I used to when I was a kid, and it's very, very therapeutic. It's very meditative. Like I exchanged my meditation time with songwriting time, and it's very, very cathartic. I mean, I haven't been this peaceful. I've not had this much peace in I don't know when. But I will say, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, do that today. Love on yourself today. Treat yourself today, and be well. I'll see you next time.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Thank you.